Since 1983, the NBA has given out a Defensive Player of the Year award to the elected best defender each season, but for most of NBA history, the award hasn't been available to some all-time great defenders. So what if we went through NBA history and gave out our own DPOYs every year before 1983? Let me say right off the bat, this was not an easy video to make. Advanced defense stats haven't been available for most of the league's history. Also, the most important part in determining good defense is the eye test, but that's hard to do when there's limited footage of older eras, so some of my choices are determined just by stats, and some are based solely on stories and reputation. So with that being said, I did my best, and if you think I got any years wrong, let me know in the comments. I'm going to start in the year 1951, since it was the year the NBA began tracking rebounds. The first player to win a DPOY in this format would be George Mikan. Mikan was famously a very slow and lumbering player, but in the paint, he was unstoppable. His presence led to the league widening the lane to 12 feet, and his shot blocking was so dominant, it led to the creation of the goaltending rule. The Lakers finished as the #1 rated defense. Mikan led the league in defensive win shares, and finished second in rebounds. The 1952 Defensive Player of the Year goes to Mikan's teammate, Slater Martin. The early 50s Minneapolis Lakers are probably the most forgotten super team in league history, and this year, their 4 Hall of Famers finished as the top 4 in defensive win shares. Martin actually finished number 4 behind his teammates, but Martin was easily the shortest guy on his team, at 5'10". He was an incredibly persistent on-ball defender, who was the only guard that could consistently lock down Hall of Famers Bob Cousy and Bill Sharman. Cousy even admitted that Martin was the best defensive guard he had ever faced. The 1953 Defensive Player of the Year goes to George Mikan. He once again anchored the best defensive team in the league, leading all players in defensive win shares and in rebounds. Officially, his 14.4 rebounds are the most he ever averaged in a season. The 1954 DPOY goes to Paul Seymour, who narrowly beats out his teammate Earl Lloyd. Seymour was a 6'1" shooting guard who played for the Syracuse Nationals. The team finished as the #1 rated defense, and were famous for their physical and mental toughness. Earl Lloyd was a 6'5" small forward, and was actually the first African American player in the NBA. Both stars were the best defenders on the Nationals, but Lloyd actually led the league in personal fouls, and Seymour finished with more defensive win shares. The 1955 DPOY goes to Mel Hutchins. Hutchins was a 6'6" forward on the Fort Wayne Pistons, who was one of the first versatile defenders in the league, as he could match up against big players and switch onto smaller guards. Hall of Famer Dolph Schayes admitted to having the most trouble against Hutchins. Celtics legend Satch Sanders credits Hutchins for inspiring him to play great defense, and Pistons teammate George Yardley even went as far as to say Hutchins was the greatest defensive player ever. Earl Lloyd had another great defensive season, as the Nationals finished as the top-rated defensive team. Lloyd played great defense on George Yardley and Mel Hutchins in the '55 finals to win Syracuse the title, but just going by the regular season, Hutchins had significantly more rebounds and committed less fouls. The 1956 DPOY goes to Maurice Stokes. Stokes was a 6'7", 235-pound forward who could score, rebound, distribute, and defend very well. Unfortunately, he suffered a head injury in a game that left him paralyzed, ending his career after only 3 seasons. He was very fast, athletic, could leap high, and some estimate he averaged 5 blocks and 5 steals over his short career. In 1956, Stokes played the center position and led the league in rebounds with 16.3, led the league in defensive win shares, and the Royals finished with the #1 rated defense. The 1957 DPOY also goes to Maurice Stokes, who finishes just ahead of Bill Russell. Russell was only a rookie, but he still showed amazing athleticism and shot-blocking prowess at a young age, as he led the league in rebounds per game. The 1956 Celtics were ranked 6th in the league defensively, but this year, they improved to the #1 rated defense. Russell did play a big part in that, but he only played in 48 games that season. Stokes played 72 games and led the league in defensive win shares and total rebounds. From 1958 to 1967, the DPOY goes to Bill Russell. Yup, you heard that right. For a decade straight, Russell dominates this award. He led the league in defensive win shares for this entire span, reaching as high as 15.96 shares in 1964. That is easily the most defensive win shares ever in a season. On top of that, the Celtics finished as the #1 rated defense during that 10-year stretch. In fairness, the Celtics had other great defenders like Bill Sharman, John Havlicek, Satch Sanders, and Casey Jones, but Russell was was clearly the best of the bunch. He also had competition from guys like Tom Gola, Bob Pettit, and Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt was the one that seriously challenged Russell the most throughout the decade. While blocks were not officially tracked during this time, there are some unofficial stats that were tracked for specific games. To highlight a few, Wilt apparently had 17.3 blocks per 23 games in 1961 and 16 blocks per 24 games in 1965. Russell's biggest advantage over Wilt as a shot blocker was his mentality. Wilt would swat balls into the stands, while Russell would hit the ball gently enough to land in the hands of his teammate. 1967 was the year Wilt came the closest to overthrowing Russell, as it was the year his 76ers won a record 68 games. But Russell still led the league in defensive win shares, and the Celtics still had the #1 rated defense. In 1968, Russell's DPOY streak gets broken by Wilt Chamberlain. This was the season Wilt famously led the league in assists and won his 4th and final MVP, and it was his defensive presence that led to the Sixers finishing as the #1 rated defense. Thanks to unofficial stat tracking, he reportedly averaged 14.4 blocks in 54 games. He led the league in rebounds and in defensive win shares. His season total of 10.73 defensive win shares is the most by any player not named Bill Russell. Speaking of Russell, in 1969, he returns to win his 11th hypothetical DPOY. 1969 was Bill Russell's final season in the NBA. He was 35 years old at this point and decided to focus all of his attention towards defense. As such, this year was his worst in terms of scoring, but he led the league in defensive win shares, grabbed 19.3 rebounds, and the Celtics again finished as the #1 rated defense. 1969 was also the year the NBA began awarding all defense honors, and Russell became the first center to be named first team all defense. The 1970 Defensive Player of the Year is a very close race between 3 players on the Knicks: Willis Reed, Walt Frazier, and Dave DeBusschere. This year, the Knicks finished as the #1 rated defense, and Willis, Walt, and Dave were named first team all defense. It's a very close call, but I'm gonna go with Frazier as the DPOY. If steals were tracked at this time, he most likely would have led the league, as Clyde was famous for his quick hands and suffocating on-ball defense. Reed actually led the league in offensive win shares, while Walt finished #2, but among the players that finished top 20, 8 including Reed were centers, while Walt and Art Williams were the only point guards that finished in the top 20, add in the fact that he averaged less fouls than Reed, and I think he takes this one. The 1971 DPOY is also a close call between Walt Frazier and Dave DeBusschere. Both stars were again named first team all defense, and were very close in terms of defensive win shares. You could go either way, but for me, DeBusschere gets the slight edge, and here's my thought process. DeBusschere was a 6'6" power forward, yet he was still one of the best rebounders in the league, averaging 11.1 per game this year. He's famously described as a hard-nosed, tenacious defender. Sometimes, he was assigned to guard centers, and he did a formidable job. Now, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar won MVP while being the defensive anchor to the Bucks. The team narrowly finished as the top-rated defense that year, but Kareem finished behind Walt and DeBusschere in defensive win shares. The 1972 DPOY easily goes to Wilt Chamberlain. He was the defensive anchor to the 33 straight-win Lakers, and most of their fast-break success came from Wilt either grabbing a rebound or blocking a shot, and then throwing an outlet pass. He was 35 years old, and again led the league in rebounds, defensive win shares, and was named first-team all-defense. The 1973 DPOY also goes to Wilt Chamberlain. Like Bill Russell, the Big Dipper's final year was his worst in terms of scoring, but he focused all of his energy into defense. He once again led all players in rebounds, and was named first team all defense. This was the last season before the NBA started officially tracking blocks, but we still have unofficial records that tracked Wilt's stats in 82 games. Allegedly, he blocked 5.6 shots per game. That would tie Mark Eaton for the most blocks per game in a season. Of course, we shouldn't accept this as gospel, but the idea that Wilt possibly beat the official record for blocks in a season as a 36-year-old with bad knees is insane. The 1974 DPOY just barely goes to Jerry Sloan. This was the hardest choice I had to make this video, so I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This year was a dogfight between Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Elmore Smith, Jerry Sloan, and Bob Lanier. Kareem was named first team all defense, was second in blocks, and second in defensive win shares, and the Bucks finished with a 93.6 defensive rating. Elmore Smith led the league in blocks with 4.9 per game. He blocked 393 total shots, which was 110 more than Kareem. I really don't understand why this season has become so overlooked. It's the 3rd highest total blocks season in NBA history, only behind seasons by Mark Eaton and Hakeem Olajuwon. There's the late great Bob Lanier, who led the league in defensive rating, defensive plus-minus, finished 3rd in blocks, and 5th in defensive rebounds. The Chicago Bulls of the early 70s are one of the most most underrated teams in NBA history, and the 74 team had an all-time great defense, led by Jerry Sloan. Sloan was incredibly tenacious with his on-ball D, and was also one of the best at drawing offensive fouls. He averaged 2.4 steals per game, made first-team all-defense, led all guards in defensive rebounds, led the Bulls in defensive win shares, and the Bulls also finished with a 93.6 defensive rating. I alluded to this at the beginning of the video, but this is what makes judging defense hard. I'm someone who cares a lot about stats, but they can be misleading in terms of defense. Centers are naturally going to have better numbers than guards, and have more opportunities to rack up blocks and rebounds. From watching Jerry Sloan specifically, my gut instinct tells me to give him the award. The 1975 DPOY goes to Elvin Hayes. Jerry Sloan had another great defensive season, but Elvin Hayes had a historically great season. Hayes put up 1.9 steals and 2.3 blocks, becoming the first player in NBA history to officially have 150 steals and 150 blocks in a season. He led the league in defensive rating, defensive win shares, made first team all defense, was third in defensive rebounds, fourth in blocks, and 10th in steals. The 75 Bullets finished with a defensive rating of 91.3. Since 1970, that is the greatest team defensive rating in league history. He definitely had help from Wes Unseld, but I still think Hayes keeps his edge. The 1976 DPOY goes to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. In his first season with LA, the captain put up 1.5 steals and a career-best 4.1 blocks. He led the league in defensive win shares, defensive plus-minus, defensive rebounds, and blocks. Dave Cowens had a great season as well, making first-team all-defense, while Kareem made the second team. Cowens stood at 6'9", which is small for a center, but he was an incredibly competitive player and one of the best rebounders in the league. Big Red's defense was one of the main reasons the Celtics won the 1976 championship, but just going by the regular season, Kareem keeps his hold on the award. The 1977 DPOY now goes to Bobby Jones. This was the second hardest choice I had to make, as great defenders like Don Buse, Bill Walton, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Bobby Jones all have great cases. Let's start with Don Buse. The overlooked Indiana guard led the league in steals with 281 total and 3.5 per game. He was named first team all defense, and his 1977 campaign is the second highest for total steals and steals per game average in a season. Kareem continued his dominant streak with 3.2 blocks and 1.2 steals. He led all players with 261 blocks, led the league in defensive win shares, and was named second team all defense. Bill Walton put up 1 steal, 3.2 blocks, led the league in defensive rebounds, total rebounds, and was named first team all defense. Finally, there's Bobby Jones. The underrated power forward put up 2.3 steals, 2 blocks, had the best defensive plus-minus, led the league in defensive rating, made first team all defense, and his Nuggets finished as the #1 rated defense that season. Since steals and blocks have been officially tracked, Jones became the first player in NBA history to average 2 steals and 2 blocks for an entire season, a feat that only Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, and Gerald Wallace have accomplished since then. On top of all that, he did his damage while playing only 29.5 minutes per game. To be that defensively efficient with only a role player's amount of minutes is insane to me. In 1978, Bill Walton wins the DPOY. Walton was on pace to have his career season in 1978 before he broke his foot after playing 58 games. Despite this, Walton still won MVP, was named first team all defense, led the league in defensive rating, defensive plus-minus, defensive rebound percentage, and was 4th in blocks. Some might disagree with this choice because Walton missed so many games, but I just can't decide who else I would give the award to. Kareem, Bobby Jones, and Dave Cowens still finished behind Walton in most stat categories. The 1979 DPOY goes to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but just narrowly. Dennis Johnson averaged 1.3 steals, 1.2 blocks, and the Supersonics finished as the #1 rated defense. Johnson was 6'4", and no player his size or smaller has ever officially had as many blocks as he did this season. Kareem led the league in blocks with 1 steal, 4 blocks, was 2nd in defensive win shares, 2nd in defensive plus-minus, and 2nd in defensive rebounds. The Lakers had no strong defensive power forward, so Kareem had to pick up much of the slack in terms of interior defense. The 1980 DPOY goes to Bobby Jones. This year was a real toss-up between Bobby Jones, Kareem, and Dennis Johnson. Jones put up 1.3 steals, 1.8 blocks, made first team all defense, and Philadelphia finished as the #1 rated defense. Jones only played 26.2 minutes per game off the bench, but most of his greatness went beyond the stat sheet. He could guard anyone on the perimeter or inside the paint, could force a lot of turnovers, was very fast, and was great at rotation. The 1981 DPOY goes goes to Dennis Johnson. It may have not been his best defensive season statistically, but DJ was still efficient with 1.7 steals and 0.8 blocks. He was named first team All-Defense and also first team All-NBA, as the Suns finished with the best record in the West and the #1 rated defense. The 1982 DPOY goes to Jack Sikma, who finishes slightly ahead of Michael Cooper. Coop was the best defender on the 80s Lakers, as he did a great job at containing all-time players like Larry Bird, Julius Erving, and Adrian Dantley. This season, he put up 1.6 steals, 0.8 blocks, and was named first-team All-Defense. Sikma was named second-team All-Defense, but he put up 1.2 steals, 1.3 blocks, led the league in defensive rating, defensive win shares, and defensive rebounds. So now that we've given out our hypothetical DPOY, what are some important takeaways? Well, legends of the 50s like George Mikan, Slater Martin, Paul Seymour, Mel Hutchins, and Maurice Stokes get some needed love. Bill Russell would be the definitive greatest defender. Wilt Chamberlain would get some more recognition as a defender. Kareem adds more awards to his already stacked resume. Legends like Walt Frazier, Bill Walton, and Elvin Hayes get a DPOY to complement their Hall of Fame careers. And underrated players like Dave DeBusschere, Jerry Sloan, Bobby Jones, Dennis Johnson, and Jack Sikma all probably get more recognition for their greatness.